these guys are going to talk to you a little bit about key things you need to think about on refitting your boat and some pointers on rigging as well. So very pleased to have you guys with us and look forward to hearing what we've got to say. Thank you. Do you need to?
Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to Berthon Boat Company and to the Bluewater event from World Cruising Club. I'm Greg Weeks and the manager of Berthon's yacht maintenance and repair department here. So we look after maintenance, repairs, refits to all the boats you see on the marina, all the boats that go through brokerage each year, which is about 200 plus, and then our customers from elsewhere in the UK and also from abroad as well who come over to us for work. There is some time available to take questions as we go through, so please feel free to ask. If you keep it to sort of general questions, that would be good. If you have any specifics about your own boat or your own thoughts, perhaps come and see us on the stand, which is just at the back of the marquee here, and we'll be happy to talk through in any more detail. Thank you. So at this stage, you've decided to realise your dream and sail around the world or sail across the Atlantic. I'm taking it up from the point where you've already chosen your boat. You've been through the process of looking at a few. You've got a list of what your requirements are, and you have selected the ideal boat for you. So you'll need to appoint a surveyor. A surveyor is an independent employed by the buyer and independent to the yard that may be doing any work, and they're there to act in your interests and to advise you on the condition of the boat. So at this stage, I'm just going to hand you over to Jim Pritchard, who is a yacht surveyor, who will just give a brief paragraph himself.
Yes, I thought I'd just say a few words about what your expectations should be of the survey. Obviously, to find the defects. And the defects is more than just finding osmosis. It's really everything in the boat in terms of structure and function, and also cosmetics. I don't think there's a person I've ever met who doesn't have pride of ownership in their yacht, so cosmetics does matter. Surveyor, having found the defects, then needs to report to you and put them all into context. He needs to explain in his report which are the vital ones which may threaten the security of the yacht and even life. Which are the functional ones, whether the toilet works or not. And also the state of maintenance, because if the boat hasn't been well maintained, although everything may be working at the time of survey, your expectation for everything to carry on working may be reduced. I'd like to mention complacency. First of all, there's no complacency in Berthons. But the industry has changed. There are an awful lot of yachts, as you know, out in marinas that never move or only move occasionally. And therefore, within the trade, people can be a bit blasé and not recognise when things really matter. And it's up to the surveyor to give you the backup to make sure that if there's a discussion, that the conclusion of that discussion ends in your, not necessarily to your advantage, but in a situation which you need. There could be a discussion on a boat down in the marina about its rudder, and if the boat loses its rudder in the Solent, gets towed in and everybody's fine. But obviously it really does matter if that boat's out in the Channel in a storm or in the Pacific in a storm. Rudders need to work, masts need to stand up, engines need to start. These things are vital. So if you're not, let's say if you're buying a boat in different territory from here, These are things that really matter. You need to understand the context of any defects that have been pointed out to you. You need to have access to your surveyor after you've received the report, and you should expect to have as much discussion with him as you think you need in order to really understand the nature of the boat that you're buying. One last thing, please leave your surveyor alone when he's doing the survey, because you'll get a much better survey out of him. He needs to concentrate, he needs to make his notes, but by all means accompany him on the sea trial, and by all means meet up with him on the boat near the end of the survey. Thanks.
Jim, question.
Yeah.
How can you find a surveyor, and how do you know that they're actually any good?
Can you just repeat the question to the room as well?
Yes, how to find a surveyor and know if he's any good, apart from coming direct to me. Well, you'll probably make contact by phone in the first place. If you've made an initial contact by email, follow it up with a phone call, talk to him, ask him what his background is. Up until about 20 years ago, just about every surveyor was an ex-boat builder, and he'd had his hands in the resin bucket and put a chisel through his head, through his arm and all that sort of thing. So he was very experienced with actually building and repairing boats, and that still counts today. So, but perhaps, maybe only a third of today's surveyors have had experience in boat building and repair. That's obviously the foundation for the experience that you need to employ. If he's done a diploma, that won't have provided him with the experience that he needs. Talk to friends, colleagues who've got boats, who've had surveys done. Also ask the surveyor if he'll send you a sample report, because that speaks volumes. Because you can then see what he's up to in the survey, what he's looking at, what he's not looking at, how he provides advice to you in the report. So yes, don't be shy at all of saying, well, can you send me a sample report, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Jim. So at this point, you've had your survey report, you're going to proceed with the sale, and this is where you need to prepare and plan the work package for your refit or maintenance period, whatever you want to call it. So you start with the list from the surveyor's report and the recommendations that they make. Then you can add to that your own list of concerns, additions and changes that you want to make to the boat. But it's important that you allocate priorities. There are important things that you need to consider, and the A items will be those that are critical to boat and crew safety. So they are items such as skin fittings and seacocks, is the keel in good condition, are the keel bolts okay, is the rudder in good condition as Jim mentioned, is the standing rigging in suitable condition, are the sails old and tired, things like life raft, VHFs, GPSs, they all need to be in service and work. The B items, I would say, are those that you really could do with in order to achieve your cruising goals. So they may be things like underwater coatings, installing a generator, perhaps increasing the electronics package, things like installing a water maker. Obviously that is definitely a bonus, but the boat will sail without it. Things like wind and solar power generation, sat phones, that sort of thing, they all come under that part of the list. Then the C items, they're the nice to haves and the home comforts. It's quite often the case that people maybe get stuck on the C items because these are often the things that really improve the appearance of the boat, and they're the nice to haves. So it might be things like installing an entertainment system, or maybe an inverter so that you can plug in your hairdryer or coffee machine or what have you. Might be a respray or new teak decks, which I have to say, fantastic to have. The boat will look great, but aren't necessarily the essentials in the early stages. It's very important to ensure that you have budget to cover the critical items and any additional critical items that may be found once you get into the refit. Things like new rudders, other items are expensive if they were to come up. Plan sufficient time to undertake the full work package. Make sure you discuss this with the yard, and then allow plenty of time once that work's finished. We'll allow time for any additional work that may come up, but also allow plenty of time for you to use the boat, come up with any additional snags so that you can get those resolved, and then actually get to know the boat before you disappear off on your adventure, because there are little things that you'll find once you board a boat and you sailed it for the first time. So what can you do to help a yard? I don't know, the pictures are quite faint, but hopefully you can see them okay.
Share the presentation around afterwards. So.
Yeah, great, thank you. So before the refit starts, it's a real help if you're able to unload all of your personal effects, all of the soft furnishings, cushions, curtains, all the things that fill up the lockers. It's amazing how much you can squeeze into a cockpit locker. And if you need to, if a yard needs to empty it all out in order to do some work, it can take quite a lot of time and therefore add cost to the bill. So it's something that you can do quite easily if you have the storage space to really help the yard out. From that point, we will then put down protective coatings onto the sole boards and joinery and things to prevent them getting damaged. As the refit evolves, it is unfortunately almost inevitable that decisions may need to be made for additional work or resolution to things that may emerge as you go through. So it's quite important to just agree with your project manager beforehand, preferred timings and methods of communication, so that if something is found, we'll always give you quite promptly costs and estimates for resolution. But if we're able to get a quick decision and carry on with the job, it benefits everyone. The worst thing in the refit is to have to down tools while waiting for parts or waiting for decisions, which leads to sort of inefficiencies and isn't good for anybody at all. It's also important that you keep a track of work lists and costs yourself, so you know what's happening. At Berthon, we send out a weekly cost report, so it just gives you an idea of where we are on costs and what the job list is at that stage. It just means that you don't get any nasty surprise at the time of invoice. I'd imagine that any other good yard would also do the same, so it's just worth asking them to do that if they can. So moving on, we're now going to undertake the refit on the boat. So starting from the bottom on the outside of the boat and working your way up. Things like worn cutlass bearings, damage, problems with your stern gear. These things often go unnoticed when you're cruising around the Solent. If a cutlass bearing's rattling a little bit, or the folding propeller's not quite working at its best, it's not necessarily a problem if you're popping out for a weekend sail, but actually when you're doing hundreds of hours and thousands of miles, these really could become quite a big problem if the cutlass bearing were to fail, either when you're mid-ocean or indeed in an area of the world where you can't get your boat lifted out of the water because it's bigger than their hoist will allow and that sort of thing. So I'd definitely say it's worth having all of this work done beforehand, just pulling the shaft out, checking the bearing, changing it if you can, making sure that folding propellers and things are serviced, balanced, cleaned and lubricated, making sure that any other underwater running gear is also in good condition. The actual cost involved in doing this when the boat's already ashore is nowhere near what it might cost if you have to do it as a separate event later on. Moving on to stern glands. These are the seal the shaft going through the hull. Many boats have what's called a stuffing box type stern gland, which has gland packing. So this is actually a maintenance item. So make sure that the gland is stripped, cleaned, and repacked. Start fresh with new grease in the greaser. And part of your weekly routine, should be to add some more grease to the stern gland from the greaser. Obviously, these are the things that at this stage may be a bit over your head perhaps, but certainly will be something that you need to consider when you're offshore. There are other types of seal that are maintenance free, but they don't go on for years. So if it's a seal that has a rubber bellows, it needs to be made sure that it's in good condition, it's not perished, and it's not likely to fail in the next few years.
I'll just chip in there for a second on the
Certainly.
stuffing gland. They're often attached with a rubber hose. Have a look at the hose, and it's amazing how often you'll find that they're all perished and about to split. They keep the boat afloat, so do change that.
So just touching briefly on bow thrusters, obviously a boat will operate without them, but you want them to be in good working order. So while the boat's in the yard, make sure that the motor's serviced and in good condition. If it has a hydraulic reservoir, it's something else that needs to be checked. Often this goes unnoticed. People aren't aware that there's any servicing needed for these items. Make sure the propellers are in good condition. Obviously the anodes are changed. And if it's a retractable bow thruster, there's a mechanism in there that needs to be cleaned in good working order before you set off also. With the steering system on the boat, so we're talking rudder stock, steering, quadrant, all the components you can see in the diagram on the right there. It's important that you are fully aware of the condition of the steering system from the rudder to the wheel. You need to ask the yard to check the whole system, ensure that steering cables and sheaves are all in good condition, that any moving parts, if it's direct drive steering, are clean and well lubricated. You don't want things corroded to fail when you're crossing the Atlantic. You need to, some rudder stocks have greases as well, so make sure that they're working and that there's grease in them. It's also recommended to remove the rudder periodically to inspect the condition of the rudder stock and the bearings. Just by checking for play in a rudder doesn't necessarily tell you that the bearings are in good condition and they'll continue to be so for the foreseeable future. So actually if the boat's ashore, it's a good time to do it. Just remember to try and do it at the time of lifting the boat if you can, because often you do need to lift the boat in order to get the rudder out to give you enough ground clearance. So otherwise you might be paying for a second lift, which is not ideal if you can avoid it. With anodes, often when boats are lifted ashore here, they don't necessarily need to be changed every year. They often have plenty of material left on them to keep you going for the next year. But if you're going to be going off for a number of years, change them all. There's no point not doing so. You don't know when you're going to lift again. You don't want to be lifting out in a year's time at the other side of the world if you can avoid it. And also make sure that if the surveyor hasn't done it already, I think some do, some don't, just check that there's continuity between the rudder, the anodes themselves and the equipment inside that it's bonded to. If the cables are broken down, often because they're in the bilges, they do get corroded and break down. Then the anode isn't actually doing its job, and you could end up with issues in other areas of the boat. So it is worth making sure that this is checked either by the yard or surveyor. With seacocks and skin fittings, this is a critical area. Something that may look okay isn't necessarily going to last the course of time. As you can see in the picture, there's just a fitting there that, although a bit corroded on the outside, actually has snapped straight through. There are a number of different types of valves: plastic valves, ball valves, gate valves, Blake's valves. They all have slightly different servicing requirements, but it's essential that you do ask the yard to go through the systems, making sure that they're working, making sure that they're lubricated, clean, checking for dezinkification, which on a bronze valve is shown by pinking, and as they dezinkify, they become brittle and can potentially break in the future, which is worst case. There are different grades of material used for some of the some valves. Has to be said that some boat builders may use a lower quality product. It's cheaper, which may not last as long. We use the best quality that we can when we're changing it, but we don't have the same perhaps cost constraints as a yard that's building perhaps a production boat. So if you're in doubt in any way, just change it. It's not worth risking anything. It'd also be worthwhile to make sure you know where all the seacocks are on the boat and labelling what they do. Just means that it's on first glance, if there is a problem, you know what's there. And also to tie alongside each seacock a wooden bung. Some surveyors, I think, request this with some sort of coding and things. Jim, is that right? Yeah.
It's a requirement if you're going to do the arc.
It's a requirement if you're going to do the arc as well, so that's covered anyway. But it's just a wooden bung. You can drive into that hole if the worst occurs.
Just if you want to know how to find out if your skin fittings are okay, if you've been frightened already, just give them a tap with a hammer. If they snap off, you know they need replacement.
Point well made there.
Can I just get one?
It happened to me last week.
Just one thing if people don't know is in terms of turning the seacocks. We try to turn them every month, 6 weeks. Give them sort of 10 turns or whatever. Unfortunately, I've got 26 seacocks, so it's quite a hefty job going around and doing all that. But we try to do it religiously, but it does take time.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. Cycling the seacocks, we call it, but opening and closing it regularly. Just make sure that it's free. You don't want to find that it's actually seized when you do need it in an emergency. So thank you. With anti-foul, there's lots of different ones on the market. I'd recommend you have the boat anti-fouled shortly before departing on the big trip. It just means that you can go longer before it needs to be done again. You're starting with a clean bottom, fresh anti-foul, and I'd say at least 2 coats of a good quality, good brand, rather than going for some of the cheaper ones. I think some of the magazines have carried out various tests, and obviously you can read that for advice on which products to use. Keel bolts, keel to hull joints. The surveyor would always carry out an inspection of the keel to hull joint, just to sign of any problems there, whether there's a gap, worse, any movement. We have lifted boats ashore here and find the keel sort of flapping around a bit. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. You can see by lifting up the sole boards that if there is any sign of corrosion or rust in the keel bolts. That centre photo is of that. So if there's anything showing up there, that's the first area to raise alarm. Sometimes surveyors will ask to remove a keel bolt for inspection, just to see if there is any signs of problem going on internally. And that might be a different keel bolt the next time, just to make sure that over time that they're all checked. They also, often it's worth just checking the torque of the keel bolt, so just checking that the bolts are done up as tight as they should be, and this is something that the yard can do for you. It's not always necessarily a big task.
One question on that. Our keel bolts, our water tank and diesel tank are on top of them. So what would you do to check those?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, okay.
Just repeat the question.
Yes, how to check keel bolts when you can't get to them, basically,
Can't even see them.
or see them because they're batteries or tanks over the top of them. Basically, if there's a good joint between the ballast and the glass fibre hull, and you can't see any movement there, then the ballast is firmly attached, and that's all you want from the keel bolts. With the sorts of boats you'll be using to go blue water cruising, that keel joint will be comparatively lowly stressed, because you'll have a very wide landing and a comparatively shallow casting, unlike the keels that have been in the news recently that have fallen off, which tend to be very deep and have a very narrow landing. So to start with, the sorts of boats that you're likely to be using, the keel bolts won't be highly stressed. You'll probably have 4 times as many as you really need to hold it on. The other thing, though, perhaps which is overlooked, is when keels have come off, as they have done and reported upon recently, it's usually started by the internal structure failing, and therefore the bottom of the boat loses its stiffness and then the keel tears out of the hull. That's been the problem rather than the keel bolts failing. So again, part of the survey is to inspect that structure and make sure that it's properly bonded and no defects in it. And also, of course, to check for any grounding damage, because that could be the start of failure of the internal structure.
Moving from the outside inside the boat, starting with engines and generators. Very important that the engines and generators are serviced before you leave, and to make sure that they are serviced to the manufacturer's recommendations for the age and hours on the engine. Sometimes that can be a more major service. Carry spare parts with you. 2 sets of routine service parts would be ideal. This means that when your service is next due, either you can do it yourself, as some do, or that you can ask a local engineer to do it for you, but you can give them the parts rather than having to wait for them to get the parts in stock, which in some of the further away places, that could be some time.
And can I just say, don't forget the pencil anodes.
Question there.
Sorry, yes.
On my engines, this morning, one of the comments made was that you might want to replace it. Do they have a set number of hours that they'll run, or how would you determine whether or not to replace the engine?
Well, do you want to take this one, Jim?
Yes, when to replace the engine. Most engines are good for 10,000 hours. That's on the assumption that they're regularly maintained and not abused. So when you acquire a boat with the engine, very valuable to be able to get the service history so you can form an opinion as to whether it has been regularly maintained. If it's, say, a 20-year-old engine that's seen 5,000 hours, I would say that you probably, and you're going off for a number of years, to places where it'll be difficult to get a new engine, and even more difficult to get the old one out and the new one in without destroying the boat. Probably you should think seriously about replacing the engine. But most engines I see have, when I'm doing surveys, have done less than 1,500 hours, and really they should have plenty more years left in them. So it's really the state of servicing over the years that counts. And if you can't find that out, then you've got to weigh up what risk you're prepared to take. Oh, one other thing, sorry. An oil sample analysis will tell a lot about what's going on inside the engine. That really is of value.
I would just say that Berthon do carry out an oil sample analysis as part of every engine service. I'm sure many other yards do that as well, so that's something that's included within as normal. It's a good idea to learn some basics about the engine, know where your seawater inlet strainer is, and where the saltwater pump impeller is, and how to change it. Something like a crisp bag or a jellyfish could easily block up the inlet, so you do need to clean the strainer. And I mean, if the inlet blocks, that's a big risk of overheat to the engine. So to be able to do that yourself on the hoof is pretty important. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to find a yard to resolve an already overheated engine. Oil and water checks should be carried out as part of the daily routine, and it's something to add to your daily checklist. Talking about sort of replacing engines and things, it is important to make sure that your engine's in good condition. It's not corroded or signs of excessive salt water over it. If you may be running absolutely fine, I think as Jim said, it's not necessarily on the number of hours, but the maintenance. So if there is signs of corrosion to various areas, it might be fine now, but they are likely to be a weak point and could fail in the future. Moving on to batteries, it's worth getting the yard to check them, check that they're operating at the capacity that they should be. If in doubt at all, replace them. Batteries you rely on them when you're offshore, and you need them to be able to take a charge as well as give you power. There is slight mention on batteries later on in this seminar, so just at that stage, just say that if it is while most are maintenance free, if it is the type that has electrolyte caps on it, just carry some spare distilled water so that you can top it up yourself and understand how that works. So you can carry that just part of your sort of monthly checks. With your fuel system, the easiest way to check your fuel is usually to just check the filters. Most fuel filters have a clear bowl at the bottom. It will enable you to see if there is any sign of water or debris in the fuel system. Before you go, it'd be a good idea if you can to drain and clean the fuel tanks. But if that's not an option, that often access is very difficult to do that. Just ask the yard to draw off some fuel from the bottom of the tank just by vacuuming some out with a vacuum pump. You can pump that into a clean jar or bucket, and that will give you an idea if there's any water or debris or fuel bug in the fuel. It's worth carrying some treatment with you for fuel bug and that sort of thing. Fuel abroad isn't necessarily as clean and reliable as it is here in the UK. So if you're able to carry a treatment that you're confident in, then you can add that every time you fuel up. Diesel heaters, very effective, work very well when used regularly. So I'd suggest that they are serviced and decoked if necessary by a specialist. We actually use a local agent to do them because heaters are fairly specialist items. They're excellent when they're working well, but they can be very expensive if they do go wrong. And to find specialists in some areas of the world may be very difficult. So start with it working as well as you can. I appreciate that in many areas that you're going to, you may not need heaters. Fire extinguishers, just make sure that they're checked by a fire specialist. Make sure that any that are anywhere near their expiry date are changed before you go. When you need them, you really need to rely on them. With some of the engine room fixed fire suppression systems, they have various service dates, such as dates when they need to be pressure tested and sometimes dates when they need to have the bottles changed. So just speak to a specialist about that and they'll be able to advise you as the best things to do. With your water system, it will see a lot more use than it would do if you were locally cruising. The fresh water pump will be relied upon. Very much recommend that you carry a spare with you and know how to change it. It's quite straightforward if you can get a like-for-like spare on board. You'll be using a lot, so you do need to rely on it. Any time that you start to see low water flow, often the cause is each outlet, whether it's a tap or a shower head, generally has little gauze in it, which is a diffuser, and they clog up with scale more quickly when you're using the pump more regularly. So they just tend to unscrew, so it's worth cleaning those on occasion to keep the system working well. Water makers, you shouldn't use them in the harbours. Polluted water is very bad for the membranes, and membranes are very expensive. So it's worthwhile before you go to go offshore and to run the water maker and check it's working okay. The yard can service all the filters and things. If you are going to use it, make sure you use it quite regularly to keep it working when you're away. If there is any period when you're not going to be using it regularly, whether it's if you leave the boat one winter, then you really should flush through the system and introduce pickling chemicals. Otherwise, over a winter, the membranes could fail, and as I said, that is quite an expensive problem to resolve. So they're quite easy to keep maintained as long as they do follow the guidelines given by the manufacturers. Toilets are another item that get used a lot more regularly when you're living on board. So you want to keep them in good condition. The pipe work can scale up and start to smell when it's old, so it's not really what you want when you're living on board. It can sort of ruin the ambience of the boat, so it's worth getting the pipe work changed if it is a slightly older boat. Sometimes it can be sort of built in by the builders and very difficult to access, so it can be quite an expensive job, but you definitely don't want to be in a situation where the toilet's starting to smell and pipe work. One way to try and keep things lasting longer is to essentially flush a lot more. When it's out of the site doesn't necessarily mean it's out of the pipe, so just making sure it's either flushed well enough to make sure it's overboard or in the holding tanks. Air conditioning and refrigerators, recommend getting those serviced by an agent or the yard. Regas, check the system over. You're obviously going to rely on them to keep your food fresh, so make sure that they're all in good working order. Particularly air conditioning, if it's got it on the boat, not all boats have it, but when you get over to the other side, you may want to use that fairly regularly. So. Bilge pumps, central lifesaver potentially. Ensure that it works. So if you flick a switch and you hear it running, doesn't necessarily mean it works. So it's a good idea if you can, either you do it yourself or ask the yard to do it, to just put some fresh water in the bilge and pump it out just to make sure it's working. It's also a good idea to have more than one option. Most boats will have potentially more than one electric bilge pump, but also have a manual bilge pump, which is completely separate system, separate inlet and separate outlet, so you've always got a bit of redundancy there if something were to go wrong. If the boat was taking on water, you obviously need to be able to pump it out. Gas systems, again, any problem there could be fairly nasty, so very worthwhile to get a gas safe agent to check the system over and provide a certificate, make any recommendations. The hoses will have dates on, so it's worth changing when they're out of date. And you may struggle to get gas of the same type around the world, so you can get various adapters and things that will enable you to use bottles from elsewhere. So it's just worth considering, and also perhaps carrying a spare bottle if you've got room. Moving on deck, we'll go through this section fairly quickly. Blocks and furling gear, they all have plastic bearings, and you need to rely on them. They've got the sheets and things going through them, and you want them to remain in good condition, because any wear to the sheaves could wear the sheets, lead to other problems later on. Make sure when you're washing the boat off that you wash them off with fresh water and give them a good spin to make sure that they operate freely, and also it will keep them lasting longer and avoid repairs in the future. Deck hatches, just worth giving the seals a good wipe with fresh water just to make sure that the seals remain in good condition. Obviously, when you're in warmer climes, you'll probably have the hatches open a lot of the time, but if you do get hit by any rainstorms, you need them to seal. Changing seals and things can be quite difficult to get hold of, so if you know what they are, perhaps carry some spare ones with you. Winches, very important part of sailing. You need to make sure they're working well. Ask the yard to carry out a full service on them. It's a strip down, clean, lubricate them correctly, change any worn parts, and also we would change the pull springs. It'd be really useful if you can get an understanding of how winches are assembled and work, because this may enable you to carry out some servicing yourself when you're further down the line, and also to change the pull springs, which are items that wear within them and should be changed periodically, especially when used a fair bit. The windlass is something that often doesn't get used that much when you're certainly when you're crossing the Atlantic. When you're anchoring in bays, it'll get used a lot more. So it's worth ensuring that it's kept clean and working. So test it regularly and lift the anchor up and down. It sees the worst of the weather up on the bow, so have a lot of salt water over it, and it can lead to corrosion. And obviously, when you want your windlass in an emergency, you need it to work. So it's well worth taking that on board. It's worthwhile when you are anchored to just put a strop to the chain so that it's not putting all the weight on the windlass shaft itself. They can bend, especially if you've got some big rolling seas that are snagging on the chain. So there's various options, but tie a rope to a cleat or use a devil's claw arrangement. With your anchoring systems, the anchoring chain, again, it's like the windlass, it's something you need to rely on. So you need to know it's in good condition. A surveyor will often range the chain for you as part of the survey. So pull all the chain out of the locker just to check the condition of it. You don't want to find when you actually need an emergency that actually the chain at the bottom of the locker has been sat in salt water and is in fact corroded either through completely or is a big ball of rust that won't come up through the hose pipe on the windlass. So make sure it's in good condition, and if in any doubt, just change the chain. In the scheme of things, it's not actually that expensive, so it's worth making sure it's in good condition and that you have sufficient, you have an anchor and a spare anchor on board. And also, a lot of people carry kedge anchors for use in various bays and things. With your tender and outboard, as I mentioned that earlier on today, I'd just say that it's important to make sure that your outboard engine is serviced and run it regularly, so they keep it in working order. It's recommended to flush it with fresh water, which you can get some flush muffs for that go around the leg, and also to carry some spare service parts with you so that you can carry out servicing when you're yourself and away from service agents. Just a recommendation really not to keep the fuel anywhere near living accommodation or where the fumes can get into living accommodation, because obviously that has a fairly high risk in itself. So often the fuel is stored in a lazarette locker or similar. Looking at the power on board, it's worth knowing the capacity that you have on board and the types of batteries fitted. This photo is a domestic cell of batteries. They are 12 2-volt cells, which give you volts and capacity of 450 amp hours. There are various types of batteries fitted to boats. Lead acid is the sort of more budget option that you'll see. They're available in lots of different size options. If they get heavy discharge, they often lose some of their capacity. They don't last as long as some of the other batteries. And also, they do need to be maintained, as I mentioned earlier, about topping up the electrolyte. Other options are gel batteries, which are very good as domestic batteries, but not at all suitable as engine starting, because they are entirely deep cycle. And then there are AGM batteries, which you may have heard of. It stands for absorbent glass mat or something like that. They're very good batteries. They're quite expensive, but they have a higher capacity for the footprint. They're maintenance free, and they take charge very well. So they do charge quicker than other batteries. And charging the batteries is something you do need to consider, and also monitoring the usage. So with power consumption, it needs to be managed. It's very important that you have an idea of what the items you use regularly, how much power they use over a daily period. So this is just an indicative chart really, but there's options to reduce the power consumption. So if you've got old filament type light bulbs for your navigation lights, then changing those to LED navigation lights can significantly reduce the current drawn by those items. Other things to note are, for example, autopilots. Autopilots don't use that much power when they are on course, but when actually moving the rudder can use quite a lot, up to maybe 15 amps. So it's worth making sure that your autopilot is set correctly and holding course. If it's constantly adjusting, it will use a dramatically increased amount of power, because the power you use during the day, you need to consider how you're going to recharge. So when you, their options are charging by engine with the alternator. If you've got a generator, you can run your battery charger, or there are alternatives such as wind generators, solar panels, and hydro generators. All have pros and cons. Wind generators are excellent if you have reasonably high winds. To see a good output of a wind generator, you really need to have at least 15 knots. But as that wind increases, the charge output increases significantly. So if you're going to be in areas that are quite windy, then they're a fantastic choice. Hydro generators, they can give a good steady output if you're going sort of 6 knots through the water. So a very good option when you're doing long trips, crossing oceans and that sort of thing. Solar panels, very good in sunny areas, but the output's fairly low in comparison. So although they're very good at trickle charging, perhaps not a solution for regaining all the power you might have used during a day's sailing. Inventory and spare parts. It's important to have a good stock of spare parts on board, spare halyards, spare engine parts, spare parts for fuel pumps and other systems on board. Know how much you've got and where it is, label it, put it in a box, and perhaps keep a list of where everything is on the boat so that you can go to it immediately when you need it. You don't want to be raking around through all the lockers and pulling things out to try and track it down. We back up our customers when travelling overseas, so consider you're never that far from a DHL office, so if anything's needed, we can always help to ship things out. So at this stage, that's the end of the refit side of the seminar. We'll move on shortly with sails and rigging. We've sort of overrun a little bit, I'm afraid, but if you'd like to take sort of a 10-minute break, comfort break, and then come back for the rigging and sails, then we'll progress on with that then. Thank you.